Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today we have Christopher Johnson, and he does all kinds of stuff. Right now he's doing fractional things, and rather than having me try to figure out what he's doing and explain it to you, let's hear it right from the source, right from Christopher Johnson. What's up, Christopher?
Good morning, Sean. Good to see you. Thanks for having me on. Basically, my whole career, I've been trying to help scale mission-driven companies that are making the world a better place. Been in the energy space the last 7 years in a variety of roles across software, hardware, project development companies. But yeah, as you said, I'm calling it up like playing fractional leadership roles within companies now.
Fractional, that's sort of like our banking system, fractional reserve banking. No,
Don't know so much about that industry,
uh-huh.
but it's common in a lot of startups where you'll have like a fractional CFO. You don't necessarily need a full-time chief financial officer, but you do need some of that support.
Yeah, and so when I met you, I guess that was at the NorCal Solar event, or were you at the climate debate too?
Well, actually, we met on a boat. Do you remember that?
Oh, one of the intersolars.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, yeah. I know you, just placing it is always tricky.
Yeah, I think that was 2017 or 2018. A little sailing adventure around the San Francisco Bay.
Oh yeah, that was a lot of fun. Too bad those Germans sold their intersolar and then it got taken down to San Diego, which is a beautiful place, and I still love that conference, but that was kind of fun being close by and
Yeah, having it local was nice.
to the Bay Area. And you live in the Bay Area too, I guess?
Yes, I'm in San Francisco.
That's where I saw you recently at the NorCal Solar 50th birthday party. And that's where you gave me your card. And the card that you gave me had Kevala on it. So that's where you're doing some fractional consulting type of leadership stuff.
Yeah, and it's actually been a really interesting learning journey for me, and coming from, really working on the hardware and product side of clean energy solutions to the deployment side, and now really on like how the grid works. And so it's been a great crash course, but it's essentially a data analytics platform that models the grid, both from the economics and physics perspective.
Yeah, I noticed you have a degree in physics.
Yeah, that's actually where I got my first taste of the solar industry. Back in 1995, we did a class on sustainability, and my group did the energy analysis of the university campus. And I remember we were so excited. This is before everything took off in Texas, and we were like, wow, there's so much potential here. And we get to present. The president of the university comes to the presentation, each of the groups doing the presentation, and he falls asleep. We were later told that the university didn't care about anything with a longer than a 2-year payback, and we had about a 7-year payback on what we were looking at.
Jeez, that's kind of crazy. Maybe they just needed a new university president.
Yes, they have a much better university president now.
One that drinks coffee and knows how to stay awake.
Well, and actually has been pushing forward both engineering and sustainability work related to climate for the university.
And what university?
That was Rice University.
Rice. Okay.
Yeah, well, I tried to environmental engineering approach there, but first of all, it was so long ago, those programs weren't very developed, but I didn't know at the time that I was going to have to go through a chemical or civil engineering degree to get to that. And chemical engineering at a university in Houston means petroleum engineering. And I was like, this is not why I'm doing this. So switched to physics.
Okay, so rice. Why did they call it rice? I'm sure it doesn't have to do with the grain.
No, William Marshall Rice was the founder.
Oh, the guy's name.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe it does have to do with the grain. Maybe his ancestors were rice farmers.
Not sure on that one.
So that's pretty cool. So you have a physics degree, everything traces back to physics. And what kind of stuff are you up to right now and in the past too?
Yeah, so when we met, I was working on a energy storage company, Blue Planet Energy, doing a lot of microgrids on the residential, commercial, community scale.
Yeah, I saw that you were the CEO and the COO there at different times.
Yeah, it's been about 5 years.
And that's a Hawaiian company, right? Were you in Hawaii?
No, still based here. The company is based in Hawaii, but we had actually had helped bring part of our R&D and operations to California and to, the Midwest. So yeah, we were all over, but technically was based there.
And were they kind of early in bringing on lithium-ion batteries?
Yeah, I, definitely was sort of like had started just as Powerwall 1 had launched and before Powerwall 2 had launched. And also, I would say very early on in bringing lithium ferrous phosphate into
LFP, yep, lithium iron phosphate. Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, and so just another thing about that too is it probably is related to Hawaii because they were the first grid that got kind of saturated with solar and were not allowing exporting.
absolutely.
And so batteries were pretty popular there. And I think a lot of people even were doing lead acid batteries, like they're, getting their houses set up with lead acid.
Yeah, I think that was the hypothesis, is that it was going to be a great market because the utility just came along and said no more export to the grid. But the market's a very cost sensitive market, and I think that's why, you comment about lead acid makes sense there. Interestingly, we saw the market in Hawaii was okay, actually much more traction with off-grid customers there who really get the value of quality battery and need to rely on it and want it to be, something that is a long-term investment, as opposed to a grid connected customer who may not have that value proposition that early in the game. Where we actually saw the market really a lot more aggressively adopting batteries was in Puerto Rico post Hurricane Maria. So we did a lot of work there. So it was really interesting to watch like Hawaii go from being leader in solar adoption, but not really making the leap to the resilience and kind of self-supply mode, to Puerto Rico just really jumping in and becoming a real leader in that. And I think Hawaii has since had some other programs where they've really accelerated battery adoption, but it was a lot slower to take off than we thought it would be.
And I noticed that you speak Spanish, I think, too, right?
Indeed.
That's pretty cool, amigo. Yeah, I'm having my heat spring class, the PV associate class, translated to Spanish right now. So if anybody's interested in a Spanish solar class, I just got some videos back today too, where the AI is doing the translation and it's amazingly good. And it's changing so fast. It's like way better than last month's version.
Nice. That's exciting. Well, and it's great to make the content available to our broader audience. So good on you for doing that.
Yeah, and then there's this one video that somebody sent me this morning, and it had myself and Bill Brooks talking about building integrated photovoltaics, BIPV, and it had both of us talking to each other with our voices in Spanish. And we're not Spanish speakers. I took it in high school, so I can, kind of understand a lot of the words and stuff like that, but, no way am I fluent. And then I have a bunch of other people that are doing the translations. And the hardest part with getting the real people to do it is the industry is so successful that all these people are all busy doing their other jobs.
Yeah. How does the AI do with the technical terms?
I should ask somebody that's more technical than me just to make sure. Photovoltaica, or, I think I was hearing that word, but that is a good question. And I'm sure that there's going to be some things that we're going to have to change. I mean, just like with AI, that's the way that it works these days. And I'll probably get some of the people to like listen to the class, or maybe I was even thinking getting some people to get a discount or give them the class for free or something like that, to get them to tell me, where their things could be better.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, we ended up translating a good bit of materials for our work in Puerto Rico. And I think to your comment earlier about being early in the energy storage game, I remember there was a report from the annual rooftop solar report that I think Lawrence Berkeley Lab does. And just as of a couple years ago, it said that 95% of solar installers had never installed a battery before. And this was at the time when we were 2017, Puerto Rico had only 5% attachment rate of batteries with solar. After Hurricane Maria, it flipped. Almost everybody was getting a battery. And so we had a lot of on the ground training with our staff and local partners there just to try and get people up to speed on like what it meant to start using batteries and getting them deployed.
Great, great. Awesome.
Yeah. So, from there, towards the end of that, we had launched a larger product because a lot of our projects were, kind of the unit itself was stackable. So you could add as many as you wanted, like modular configuration. And so we made a larger version that got us into then basically the project development space of actually having to finance projects, doing energy as a service. And that was definitely a new area for me. But then I took that with quite a bit further, working with a Native American tribe, doing renewable energy project development for about a year. And that was definitely new, again, the project development space just different from my product development and just startup growth space. And so that was both looking at like C&I behind the meter stuff, but also utility scale from acquisition and investment perspective, trying to get this tribe to have alternative revenue streams to their gambling income.
Where was the tribe? Is it in Puerto Rico or?
No, this was actually the Seneca Nation out of New York.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. So the tribally owned business is a IRS regulated tax structure. So they get various different advantages. But that's a lot of how, like, because tribes don't pay taxes, but they also don't get the services and investments that we get from paying our taxes. And so tribes have to have their own income stream. So these tribally owned businesses are what funnels the income for the tribe to use for everything from healthcare and roads and police officers and et cetera, et cetera. So that's why a lot of the tribes have these gambling businesses, but the Seneca Nation was trying to diversify its income streams.
Great. Yeah. I just did a class in Coos Bay, Oregon, which was a really beautiful place. And one of the guys in the class was from the local tribe, and he was there because he wanted to figure out how to do things besides gambling, something that's like better for the planet
Yeah.
than gambling. And so that sounds like a great transition. Maybe you could talk to him.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's actually a group called the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy that's trying to also work with across a number of tribes. And Seneca Environmental is working with a number of tribes as well. That's the actual renewable developer company name that's owned by the Seneca Nation.
Yeah, maybe I'll introduce you, maybe more consulting for you. And then I think I noticed you were like in college or something. You were in a Native American club.
Yeah, I helped to start called it the Native American Student Association.
So are you Native American, I guess?
Some bloodstream mix
Mm.
there in the past, yes. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. All right. Let's see. So Kevala, any more about that you want to talk
Oh
about?
yeah, so kind of the arc there was like trying to deploy batteries and really the distributed energy resources. I mean, it's just hard, as you know. It's just there's so many things that I feel like we're just banging our head against the wall. It's like this should work. This should be the solution that's getting massively uptake. And why is this not working? And I stumbled upon, I was leading the SEPA energy storage working group for a while there and working on some research to present there and found the work of Chris Clack from Vibrant Clean Energy. And he modeled what is the most cost-effective way to get to 100% clean energy grid. And it was one of the most complex and detailed models for this at the time. And one of the things that really struck out to me about that is he said, like most models, they treat the distribution grid like a black box. And he actually went very detailed in the analysis there. And we hear this debates between like, oh, should it be these giant solar farms in the desert? Now we need to build big transmission lines and get them to the cities, et cetera, or the wind, the same. Or do we need to do distributed stuff? And his answer was, we need both. But we need the distributed stuff first because they're going to act like shock absorbers for these large projects once they come along. And so I was like, okay, great. I feel more empowered about focusing on this distributed side. I really feel like this is the right thing we should be doing. But how? Like having a great product and deploying it just isn't working. And Kevala is interesting in that like it has a really detailed model of the distribution grid and is able to run both the physics as well as the economics of how the grid works. And what I saw in that is like, okay, because we have this utility monopoly structure business model that's not going to change anytime soon, we've got to get those folks on board with what the value of these distributed energy resources are. And in order to do that, we have to be able to show them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Kevala is throwing a lot of computational power at this to get these insights faster. So instead of a utility planner or operator just being like, oh, well, I don't know if I can use those DRs, maybe I'd have enough, maybe it won't work, they can actually see how to work. And so this should actually enable more use of carbon-free energy resources and more distributed resources. And then hopefully that will then lead them to having more value on the grid and programs being put in place that promotes them.
So you're essentially modeling the grid, and then what would happen if you added distributed resources or any kind of resources to the grid?
Yeah, the Kevala platform is like a bottom-up model. So it starts at the parcel level. So every service point is modeled from its load profile. And then you can model adoption of different technologies at any point. So for instance, we did a large study for the California PUC back in 2013. And in California, we have this policy of 100% EV adoption by 2035. And the CPUC said, what's going to happen to the grid when we do that? And so this study modeled across all three IOUs, 12.5 million customers, pulling in all of their smart meter data, right? Years worth of AMI data, and then projecting out the adoption of energy efficiency, EV charging infrastructure, solar, batteries, building electrification, netting that out at the parcel level, because some of those are adding and some of them are subtracting load, and then aggregating that up through each point of the grid to figure out where they're going to be overloads and where our assets going to need to be upgraded to increase capacity to serve all this electrical load.
So with your customers would be like you were saying, the California PUC, that's Public Utility Commission. And also you were talking about the investor owned utilities, that's IOUs.
Exactly. Yeah, it's pretty broad, but those are definitely two groups of customers. We also work with a number of developers, both whether that's kind of community scale solar or EV charging or EV OEMs who are looking to site charging infrastructure and want to know about the condition of the grid. We also work with some national labs, work with policy and advocacy organizations who need the analytical insights. Because one of the things we do is we layer on top scenario analysis, right? So because we have a lot of the software in the space that exists today is more of an on-premise, something running on your desktop kind of thing. It's not very scalable. And when you try and crunch all this data, it takes a long time. It can take days or a week just to run one computation. And so Kevala's put this in the cloud and made it scalable. So you can just scale up more servers to run a computation. And so it can go a lot faster. And so instead of just saying like, let's look at the summer peak hour, and that's the only thing we can look at because that's all our computer can handle, like crunching the data on, we'll actually do an 8760, look at every hour of the whole year. And then we can look at different trends on how things are changing with the different adoption of DERs, like how's the peak moving, but also we can look at different scenarios. So in this California study, we looked at like a low and a high adoption of EVs, right? And we also looked at some different scenarios for NEM tariffs and how that would affect things.
So one of the things that I think that's really going to help this is just juggling around the electrons to make it work. And so you're not overloading the wires with something like a virtual power plant, a VPP. You seem like you'd be in the prime position for organizing something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a white paper coming out shortly on VPPs. I'm not directly plugged into what's going on there. And right now we're on, like, I'd say the Kevala's on the planning and operations side, but not necessarily the control of assets.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also a great way, I think, to work with different solution providers who would want to figure out what is the value of what we're contributing. One of the things I've been learning a lot about is like, how do these utilities make their rate cases, right? What is the data they use and are going to be presenting to justify changing rates? And so learning about things like the marginal cost of service and how that can be disaggregated across the grid and assigned to different contributors to that. But if we have a solution, so for instance, with this California study, the number that came back in terms of like, if we look at what's going to be needed between now and 2035,
100% EVs. And I guess that would just be only the new cars. It's not like they're going to take an old car and.
yeah, I think it was about 13 million EVs. Now, and that's the personal vehicles, but also the medium and heavy duty stuff, right? And that's where really start putting some big loads on certain spots in the grid. But the distribution grid upgrade cost to meet that, we don't do any sort of smart charging or any of that. We just try and meet that, adding those about 13 million EVs, $50 billion. Now, if we start bringing in solutions that can, so for instance, a VPP, maybe we have some managed charging solutions, et cetera, those things could start reducing that $50 billion. And so essentially this analytical platform can start to establish what's the value of some of these solutions that could be coming along. And in that sense, deferring investment, being smarter about all capital investment, which hopefully leads to lower electricity rates for us.
Wow. Okay. So 13 million EVs, and that would be in total by 2035 in California?
Yes.
And then $50 billion to upgrade the grid if you don't do bidirectional charging and all that kind of stuff. And I guess it would be like virtual power plants, charging your car at non-peak times and all that kind of stuff. So how much would it be the other way? I would even think that there might even be some scenarios if we use the bidirectional charging and virtual power plants and things like that, where it might even save money and be kind of the opposite.
Well, I think what you're pointing to there is something that is interesting with can't remember who published the report recently, but essentially the amount of EVs we already have is increasing demand for electricity. That is increasing the revenue and the profits to the utilities, and it's actually creating a downward pressure on price. So ultimately, if we're efficient about this should lead to some cost reductions as we electrify. However, I think we need some more governance and oversight to make sure these investor-owned utilities are using the funds wisely.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. Because they need to record profits and all that kind of stuff. And there's always the politics and who runs the PUC and get a lot of drama with the net metering 3 and all that kind of fun stuff.
Right.
So yeah, maybe you could be a politician and really get things sorted out. It seems like I kind of think there's too many lawyers running things and we need more engineers.
I thought about that and I asked a friend who works much more in politics, and she assured me that not very much is getting done there. So, and I really like the getting things done part, like feeling like a difference. So I'm open to it, but I'd like to feel like it's a good use of time.
Yeah, maybe I should start making renewable energy classes for lawyers.
There you go.
We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show.
Actually, on that same sailing trip, I met somebody from CALSA on the policy side, and I hadn't been very involved in the policy side, but I've had a positive relationship with the policy folks I know, because I'll call them and be like, hey, what can you tell me about this thing? I don't know what's going on here. And they'll call me and be like, hey, what's a black start? Or hey, can a battery do this? And hey, what happens if it's a smoky day? Like the practicality of how the stuff works. So I was like, okay, this is good. It's good that you start to understand this because you're writing rules about it.
Yeah, I know. Yep. It's pretty important stuff. And then you also said that you were on a working group with SEPA. And so SEPA used to be called the Solar Electric Power Association, and then they changed it to the Smart Electric Power Association. That way they can include energy storage and electric vehicles, I guess, and all that. But they put on the RE Plus, formerly known as SPI conference, with SEIA, Solar Energy Industry Association. And SEPA, I think is more on the utility side of things from the utility perspective. They invited me to a SEPA dinner at RE Plus in Boston this year, which was kind of nice to just kind of meet all those people there. So they have working groups, and then also SEIA has working groups. And so what do you see as the difference? Is it like it's more of a utility perspective?
The way it was explained to me was Blue Planet Energy, we were figuring out which of those groups should we participate in. And, it's a startup with small team. You got to choose where you're going to put your energy. It was explained to me that SEPA was more on the research side and SEIA was more on the policy side. I don't know to what degree that may still be true. This was 5+ years ago at this point. And I think it is a significant number of utility, like a large portion of their customers or members are utilities, but there was still a diverse group, but they have a lot of engagements that are kind of research oriented. And at that time, it was interesting to be part of like helping them to shape the agenda. I also participated with our research council, which was again, shaping some of the strategic direction. But yeah, I'd say fairly utility heavy.
Okay, so I haven't heard it explained that way. So you were saying research for SEPA and policy for SEIA. I've been involved with some SEIA working groups for like the National Electrical Code, solar and storage, and all that kind of stuff. They organize that. Yeah, and so if anybody's out there has a great idea for the National Electrical Code, they can go to the SEIA website and look for their working group and sign up, get involved, and work for free. It's a lot of fun.
Exactly. The working group, yeah, the SEPA working groups are same where it's volunteer, driven. I would say it's like, all right, this is a duocracy, folks. If you want something to be different, you got to show up and do something about it.
Mm-hmm. So also you were talking about 13 million EVs, $50 billion. Did you also decide to go, let's see what happens if we add a smart grid and solar and storage and all that kind of stuff? Did you come up with a different number?
So those 5 scenarios that were done with the original study did include adoption of solar, battery, energy efficiency, building electrification. And the way the model works is looks at adoption propensity of every place on the grid. And so it'll take into account different socioeconomic situations and other factors that may affect, does this particular customer choose to adopt any of these particular technologies in any given time frame? But what it didn't look at, and so this was the CPUC has this that's called a high DER proceeding.
So DER, distributed energy resources.
Exactly. And I don't remember the number of the proceeding, but essentially this first part of the study was to, I would say, just simplifying it, like scope how big the problem could be. And there's supposed to be a second part that's coming, which is to say, Now, what can we do about it? And that's really to look at the mitigation strategies and how much of those would reduce the problem. So that part hasn't happened yet, but there was some work done that did look at mitigations with the Department of Energy did a transportation electrification impact study that looked at 5 states. And this was to look at some of the tailpipe standards that the EPA was working on to see what would be the impact of high EV adoption, in part because they wanted to make sure there wasn't overly burdensome costs of pushing for higher EV adoption. And so this looked at 5 states and did look at the mitigation impact of managed charging in particular, and found that that could massively reduce the cost, which, no surprise, you get a little smarter about how we do these things and it can be better for the grid, right? I mean, we're in this period where we've gone from decades of flat load growth to a period of rapid growth between electric vehicles, which have really been driving this. We're electrifying everything. And then now we have all these data centers coming online, so that there's like now big load growth. And we have to be smarter about this because the load's growing faster than we're getting through the whole permitting and interconnection process to bring more generation on.
Yeah, I guess maybe a benefit with the load growth is that it makes a huge demand for the cheapest electricity producer out there, which is PV these days. So it could bring down the price of PV even faster.
Yeah, well, I'd just be curious on your thoughts on this, Sean, because a lot of these things coming on, whether it's like a data center or, it's like electrolyzers, because hydrogen's getting a lot of attention these days, but those things want to run 24/7. So yes, we can get them some great cheap solar energy during the day, but if they're 24/7, it just seems that like we're kind of creating just more demand for natural gas in those off hours.
Yeah, like I would say too that they want to run 24/7, but then if there's some event, there's always going to be, somebody will have to draw the line somewhere where it's like, we'll turn it off right now. Maybe it's only hours a year where they turn it off, where it's worth it to turn it off. Yeah, and then hopefully as the price of solar goes down, if it goes down fast enough, it makes hydrogen work better too.
Yeah, I think that happened a couple of years ago when Texas was on the brink of not having enough electricity and the Bitcoin miners were turning off their mining. That was also at a time, though, the Bitcoin price was so low that it was actually, I think, more expensive for the electricity to mine a Bitcoin than it was
Uh-huh.
for the Bitcoin. So it sort of worked out there. But I feel like now we've kind of shifted that. Now that's coming to the AI industry. And I've heard that in PJM territory, they've just, that sort of data center alley, they've had to slow down the interconnection of new data centers. And a coal plant that was planned to be pulled offline, it can't go offline because they just need that capacity.
Yeah, I was even thinking too, with all this AI and everything, maybe AI would work better, cheaper, faster when there's more electricity available. And then you ask a question and it's like, oh, this question is going to cost you, the electricity is a little bit harder to get, or they'll give you a worse answer. And I kind of look at the AI, it just like there are all these computer chips out there. It's kind of like the Bitcoin thing too, just a bunch of computer chips out there. It'd be interesting if someday the price of Bitcoin goes up when electricity is more expensive. I don't think it's going to be that fast, but if
Yeah.
it's harder to get. But I mean, you look at some of those events that they had in Texas, I think the price of electricity went up like crazy.
Yeah.
So when the electricity is more expensive, it's just not going to pay to leave those things on.
Yeah, and there already are some interesting efforts to try and have computationally heavy companies be kind of smarter about how they run their loads of computation. It's even a session during Climate Week on this, where, essentially you can choose when you do some of your heavier computing loads, and that's gonna thus impact when you're using more electricity. So literally like lowering that use during hours when the grid is dirtier. It's been really amazing. Actually, one thing I'll say just from the work on the project development side that I've found, and really was involved with the Clean Energy Buyers Association, which brings in these corporations who are trying to buy clean energy, connects them with developers. And a lot of these deals go through with a VPPA, a virtual power purchase agreement structure, which is kind of insanely complicated. But one thing I learned from this, and this is where Google and Microsoft and Amazon and all these folks are out there acquiring massive amounts of clean energy so that they can say they're powered by clean energy. And last year, of all the clean energy, all the solar that came online, half came online through these corporate VPPA structures, which is a massive, massive push in the market.
Can you tell us more about that? You're saying the Clean Energy Buyers Association and corporate PPAs?
Yeah, so the Clean Energy Buyers Association is a member association, and they'll help companies who are trying to be like, okay, how do I buy clean energy, right? And they offer trainings. They just had their conference, I think last week, their spring conference. And a lot of the deals are happening now through this virtual PPA. So, a PPA, like the structure, like, okay, you get financed to put solar on your roof. So you're kind of paying per kilowatt hour for the solar coming off, but you didn't have to put up the money up front. A virtual PPA is like you're doing a PPA similar to that, but the system is not on your premises. It's somewhere, it's virtual, is that it's somewhere else. And it ends up being a three-party deal structure. So the corporate off-taker that they're called for like basically agreeing to take that power is agreeing to pay a fixed price for every kilowatt hour coming off the system. Now that goes to the developer, the IPP, but the power goes into the market, right? So it doesn't, the power is not going to that customer. And so it's essentially like a contract for differences, because if the price at that node where the power is being injected, it's going to go up some days, it's going to go down some days. And so some days there'll be a loss and some days there'll be a gain. And that goes back to the corporate customer. But the developer can use that fixed price from the off-taker to get the project financed.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So we got Clean Energy Buyers Association. Is that full of lots of big companies like Amazon and Walmart or whatever?
Yeah, there's definitely like the Amazon, and Microsoft has a very progressive procurement process for clean energy. So they look at things like water and sustainability and community impact and environmental justice. So Amazon is a big buyer, but they also are trying to figure out how to bring this to, things outside the Fortune 100. So they look at different risk and credit challenges that smaller companies have. Because as you imagine, it's, you're doing a 15 to 20-year deal. It can be harder to get the credit worthiness to get the financing if your off-taker is not a publicly traded or investment grade company.
Great. So we talked a little bit about the Texas, and one thing that always puzzles me is that they're supposed to be all about freedom, but then they can't share their grid with their neighbors. And it's just good to be able to benefit from having a connection. I think what it is too is they can share DC power, but not alternating current, which seems like a strange rule. But if you really needed some power and your neighbor had a bunch of extra, and it would probably go the other direction too, it seems to me having a lot of east-west connections would be a good idea. I know there's a lot of, not in my backyard or NIMBYisms and all that kind of stuff. Have you modeled any of that, like installing some renewable energy transmission lines that would make it so Texas would be included in other grids? Or I'm not too sure of the politics of that. Maybe they just want to, remain their own country. Uh,
Great question. I haven't been involved in that. And one thing I'll just mention in case you want to go deeper on the Kevala stuff is we could also just have somebody who's been one of the leaders in the team who've been around longer to come on your podcast as well if you want to.
yeah.
I know there's a lot of DOE funds going towards different studies, and been hearing about like transmission studies and other things as well that are getting done, because this is the kind of long-term thinking. If it takes 10 years or 20 years to build one of these transmission lines because of all the things you're talking about, the NIMBYism and permitting and all of that, we should think through really where we want to build the thing, because we get it wrong, it's a pretty big, expensive miss. But yeah, I mean, just the enormous amount of wind and solar generation that's happening and is potential in Texas is incredible, and in other parts of the country. So yeah, it'd be great to link that up with some major loads.
Yeah, like I'm sure there's going to be some times when they have extra and other times when they don't have enough. And so it's just good to share with your neighbors, especially with solar. When you go east to west, you've got 4 different time zones in the continental United States. So it's sunny in one place, dark in another place. And then, of course, you have wind that blows differently in different places. And it would be nice to make all those connections.
Yeah.
So another thing earlier on, you mentioned something about the Powerwall 1. And so you were talking about the Blue Planet battery coming out between the Powerwall 1 and the Powerwall 2. Have you ever seen a Powerwall 1? They were so rare. Like the Powerwall 2 is kind of easy to spot. It's kind of rectangular. And the Powerwall 1 had this smooth contour to it. And I did see some dummy Powerwall 1s. In fact, it was at Intersolar where we first met on the sailboat for that conference. And then did you ever do the Tesla solar tour too? We went to the factory.
Yeah, I did that one of those.
Yeah, so NorCal Solar, the organization where I just met you at the 50th birthday party, we were organizing the sailing trip and we were organizing the Tesla factory tour. I always just thought it's kind of interesting that the Powerwall one, it's so rare. Sometimes I go, did they really make one? I mean, I think Bill Brooks says he has some at his house, or, that it's kind of like somebody gave him some Powerwall ones, something like that. But it was a DC Powerwall, didn't have an inverter in it. And a lot of people used it with the Solar Edge inverter, just like they were using the LG Chem, like it was listed to go with the Solar Edge inverter. And then right away they came out with the Powerwall 2, and then that one has an inverter in it. And now there's even a Powerwall 3 where it has an inverter in it and you can plug solar PV into it. So that was kind of cool too, I guess. But have you seen a Powerwall one
I don't think so.
that had real batteries in it?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, but also like how many of those were even made? Because that was so early in the days. In the Powerwall 2, they probably got 2 or 3 or 4 orders of magnitude more production than they
Oh
ever
yeah,
had.
yeah, like so many more, yeah. Because it's like I didn't even see it. I remember they even had some power walls. They didn't even call it a power wall. I think it was just like the Tesla battery before the Powerwall one. And I remember having screenshots of it and I'd show it in my classes and stuff like this. And it was just like somebody put a battery in a box and
Yeah.
that's how research and development goes. What do you think about the future of bidirectional electric vehicles?
Well, I mean, we've been talking about batteries and deploying batteries and getting more batteries on the grid and using them. And now we've got batteries in vehicles, and the vehicles are more fun to drive and they're cheaper to operate. And oh, look, they can be a resource too for the grid. I mean, I feel like that's really potentially going to eat into stationary energy storage, at least on the residential commercial scale market, because this is like a multi-purpose battery, right? Like not only can you store energy in it, but you can also drive it around. And it seems inevitable that battery or that vehicle as a resource, both in terms of where to put extra solar production in the middle of the day, when our prices are going negative on the, wholesale market in California, or when you need to pull some power in the evening when, oh man, if that's the option to avoid a brownout, that seems like a much better option than a brownout. But like between now and let's say 5 to 7 years from now, when getting the customers coordinated and on board so that kind of orchestration can happen, it seems so messy right now. But I think we've got to get there because there's going to be so many of these vehicles and they're such a great resource.
Yeah, it seems to me that the hard part is probably going to be the policy. We already have the technology, the code allows it and everything, but the manufacturers of the electric vehicles and the utilities and the Public Utilities Commission and how are we going to work it and the virtual power plants and all that kind of stuff. But I think that the demand is there. One of the things that I always point out is that not too far from where we live down at Moss Landing, they have a 3 gigawatt hour energy storage system, so largest one in the world. But you're in San Francisco, and within a couple miles of you, there's way over 3 gigawatt hours of batteries just sitting in these cars that are 95% of the time, something like that, just sitting there connected to the grid, not doing a thing.
Yep, exactly. I mean, I think the EV manufacturing is getting to a point of maturity with regard to the batteries that the manufacturers are getting more okay with it. But I know early days, I mean, start to see both with their stationary storage as well as their cars, like, I think Tesla gets nervous about more cycling on the battery, right? I think a current report just came out saying they're degrading faster than they claimed they were. And this is going to add extra cycling to an EV if you're going to start discharging it to the grid. So what is that going to do to the cycle life and performance?
Yeah, well, maybe the warranty should be on cycles and have some kind of algorithm where you figure out instead of miles, instead of years, it could be cycles or all three, whatever. And when you cycle it down too much, it's worse than if you keep it charged between certain parameters and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think that someday it's got to be that way.
Yeah. If you start using your battery for non-driving purposes, then the warranty should reflect that. I know like the F-150 Lightning came out with that capability. I'm not sure, now there's so many EV models. I'm not really sure where it is, but I know for some of them, it was like if you used it bidirectionally, you just kind of voided your warranty,
Yeah.
years ago. So
Oh yeah, for sure. Mine. Yeah. And maybe there could be some way where you just say, okay, you can only cycle it up and down when it's between 60 and 80% charged, and you can only do 5 kilowatt hours. I mean, there's some way to do it. And the way I also look at it too is that the people that are against it the manufacturers for warranty issues and things like that, and the utilities because they want to have the business be theirs. They're going to be the people that I think want it the most in the future because the grid isn't going to work with that. And people are going to turn against electric vehicles if it turns the grid off. And so eventually we're going to have the people selling the cars and the people around the utilities going like, yeah, we want more bidirectional vehicles. And so just all part of evolution.
Yeah. Although we'd have to come up with whatever it's not really NEM, I guess, like how do you compensate for that? Because certainly I don't think it'd be,
Yeah.
I remember I had a friend who had a Powerwall. He had long time had solar and then he got a Powerwall put on the system and we were talking about the true up bill, right? Like, so, 12 months later you get this thing saying, and he had like $1,000 true up bill and he's like, what's going on here? And I was like, well, are you using your system in self-supply mode? And he's like, no. I was like, how do I do that? So we go in and we looked at the Powerwall interface and the settings, and it knows like what PG&E rate he was on. And so we went and we tried to toggle it to self-supply mode, and it wouldn't let him do it. And his time of use rate difference was so small that it was basically saying it's not worth it, which I think it was calculating was basically like the cost of degradation to the battery of cycling is more than the savings you get from doing this, which is just like a perverse market signal, but also like,
Yeah, like I'm grandfathered into the what they would call net metering one. So there's no time of use and I get full credit for exporting. So there would be no financial case at all for grid support with my battery the way it is. But if they were smart enough and the Public Utilities Commission and everybody could get together and do some sort of virtual power plant thing, then they could make it work.
yeah. And when you say, this is one of those things where I feel like it's so confusing that it's no wonder that we can't get a lot of broader public participation in some of these debates about NEM is like, it's so confusing. When you say you're on NEM 1, you get full credit. So if a kilowatt hour costs 24 cents, you export a kilowatt hour, you get 24 cents credit.
Yeah.
And there's no cap, right? So you can actually make money.
Well, no, if I make more than I use, which, there's no way I'm going to be able to do that with the size of the system that I have. It came with the house. But if I did make more than I use, I wouldn't get anything. But I get full credit. It is a tiered rate. So it's like for the first amount of electricity for the month is less expensive than the last amount. And then if I offset,
Okay.
it's like it's so many kilowatt hours, they have that. That's kind of like a West Coast thing with a lot of utility rates. And that was really good for solar, but it's a 20-year grandfather. And I think I'm less than halfway through that. The house that I'm in right now, it came with solar, and my mom's similar. But another thing, too, that's kind of a bummer is let's say that I added solar, all of a sudden, the old solar that I already had switches over to NEM 3. So it would be financially stupid for me to double the size of my system.
Right. Yeah, and I'm on NEM 2, and because I did it with a battery as well, I'm on what they call EV2A, I think is the rate structure. So it's a time of use, but it really tries to promote you using the battery and not using the grid during the evening. So my rate goes from like 16 cents a kilowatt hour during most of the day to 45 cents kilowatt hour between 3 to 4 is like a shoulder, but it's basically 4 to 9 is the time of use rate. So I have the battery basically set in a self-supply mode and actually even just do grid charging if there's not enough charge so I can offset that because 45 cents a kilowatt hour is ridiculous, right? To be paying for, when everybody comes home and I'm trying to electrify everything. So there's actually loads happening there. So I barely export. I export less than 10% because I barely, only in summer. In winter, I can't make enough just given the size of my system. But on NEM 2, you only get generation portion credit. So maybe that's 9 cents. But what I think people don't understand, and I'd love to figure out some kind of good like metaphor to explain this, right? You're getting this full 1-for-1, right? Give a kilowatt hour, you get the full price. Whereas
Yeah.
I'm getting like a third back. And then NEM 3 is even worse, like you're getting a fraction of, which is crazy because the utility then turns around and sells that same kilowatt hour to your neighbor for 24 cents, right? Or at least in the case of NEM 3, right? They might give 2-3 cents, a cent, and then turns around and sells it for 24 cents.
Yeah, it just seems to me that it would be so much better for the grid if they figured out a good way to do something like a virtual power plant and just control everything, put the engineers in charge instead of the attorneys.
Yeah, are you
Uh,
saying like as a replacement to the NEM scheme?
yeah, I mean, maybe they would still keep the NIM scheme, but then have different options. And so the virtual power plant option, something like that. And then you would have your virtual power plant provider that's sort of like your advocate that takes a piece of the action. And they already have those, and especially in Germany, it's like a lot more mature than it is here. But I know that Sonnen is doing it, Sonnen, Sonnen, however you want to pronounce it. They changed to the German pronunciation in America as a Sonnen. And they have one in Utah that's been up for a while, the Soleil Lofts. And I believe Tesla's doing it too. And I think Sunrun, and I know they're all looking into it. There's a lot of ways that you could help the grid, and it might not be with a car yet, but I think it will be in the future. And another thing too is the Nissan Leaf has been bidirectional for a long time. A lot of people don't realize that. But the problem with bidirectional is getting a UL listed bidirectional inverter with an interconnection. I don't think that you can really do that quite yet.
Right, because it's a different process than installing a charger if you're installing bidirectional.
Yeah, so you can export and all that kind of stuff and have it be the proper UL listing for that. And then when I say I don't know yet, I had a couple of people on my podcast from Fermata Energy, and they're developing it. It might have happened since I talked to them. Like it's right in the process. It probably has.
Yeah, I mean, all this comes down to getting smarter about managing the grid, right? Because we need more precision, we need more granularity on like what parts of the grid are stressed, what moments of the grid are they stressed in them, and what resources do we have that we could deploy for this? Because everything from smart thermostats to the vehicles to these batteries and solar systems, all of these resources. I mean, I like the Rewiring America talks about tens of billions of machines, right, that we're electrifying and having on the grid that could all be resources.
Yeah, if we can control the sources, the loads, all that kind of stuff, there's just a whole lot we can do. Another example that I've used a lot is if you took your average American house and it uses 10,000 kilowatt hours per year, approximately 240 volts. And if you do the math and divide by the hours and figure out the amps, the average American house uses less than 5 amps continuously on average. So instead of a 200 amp service, maybe we should just get a 5 amp service. But, of course, that's not going to be the case. But it just goes to show you that there's lots of peaks and valleys. And there's a lot of times where we're using less than 5 amps, and a lot of times we're using more than 5 amps at 240 volts.
Yeah, exactly. And just getting smarter about like, okay, we could actually manage at the panel level, like how much consumption is happening so you don't go over that service. I ran into a friend who was doing a garage remodel and just wanted to put an EV charger in. They don't even have an EV yet. And they ran into, okay, you got to upgrade your service panel for 100 to 200 amps. And then that triggered a service transformer upgrade on their block, which was 9 months waiting for, PG&E to come swap a can out. And that was just one upgrade of one level 2 charger.
Yeah, crazy. They replaced our transformer, the one that's near my house recently.
Yeah, back to the CPUC study, I talk about like the increasing the distribution capacity expansion that will be needed. In that study, it estimated 500,000 service transformers are going to need to get upgraded in the next like 10 or 11 years.
Wow, that's quite a big number, 500,000.
Yeah.
But we have a lot of people here though, so that would be like out of 350 million or something like that people in the US. So that's one transformer per 7 people.
Oh, but that's just in California though.
Oh, just in California. Oh, that's more than a transformer per person. Okay. Get your transformer now. I know that's like a huge thing right now too, is the backlog of transformers. They can't make them fast enough. In fact, I need to go find out who's making transformers and invest in their stock.
Right. And I think like California is actually in an advantage here because we're on the front end of this adoption curve, right? So hopefully the utilities are all starting to do their procurement and line this up so that we get it. But like imagine all the other states where they're just starting to hit the ramp on EV adoption. They're just starting to feel this electrification crunch on their grid. It hasn't even hit their distribution planning cycle yet. So they've started the procurement yet.
Yeah. So I was looking into getting an EV charging rate, and it would be stupid for me because I'm grandfathered into this like really good net metering that's super awesome and all that stuff. And I don't want to mess with that. And I was looking into like other options, and I could get a separate meter. If I had all the free time in the world, I would go do it myself. But of course, people in our position in the industry don't have all the free time in the world. But otherwise, it makes no financial sense for me to decide, oh, should I charge it at night? Should I charge in the day? All that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, it kind of comes down to like, do you opt into being a good grid citizen, right? Like, because you know what the grid wants, right? And you could do that, but you're not actually financially incentivized to do it.
Yeah, and all the good warm feelings that I have for my utility and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, they came and they cut down all these trees by the house and they left a huge mess and they won't clean it up. And then the fire department's after me and all that kind of stuff. So I don't have that warm, fuzzy feeling right at this moment.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry to hear that, both for the trees and for the mess.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that they're cutting down the trees so the power lines don't hit them to prevent fires. And then they leave a big mess, which is a fire hazard.
Right.
And the fire department is coming after me for it. It's like, clean up your mess, utility. So I won't mention the utility or anything like that.
No, couldn't
Uh,
possibly guess.
They would put a hit on me. So let's see, is there anything else that we should cover or talk about?
That's a good question. And it's been a good conversation. We've covered a lot of ground.
So like, I know that you work for all different companies. Are you still looking for more business?
Yeah, I've got some capacity for additional work with some companies that tend to look at like having some kind of a retainer where I'm taking on something. A lot of what I've done is like work with a CEO to take something off their plate because
Oh,
I've done so many things in the past, worn a lot of hats.
maybe you could translate some of my classes into Spanish. That would take stuff off of my plate.
I'm not sure my technical Spanish is quite good enough. I'd have to be asking some of my friends first.
So how should people get a hold of you?
Yeah, I think if you want, I can drop like a LinkedIn.
So like probably anybody connected to me will see you first or second degree on LinkedIn. And so that's Christopher Johnson. You have a very nice name where there's not too many different ways to spell Christopher Johnson. And we'll put it in the show notes and stuff too. So just look for Christopher Johnson in LinkedIn. And also look for Sean White on LinkedIn. That's an SEAN. There's multiple ways of spelling Sean. Mine is the best, of course. And then get Christopher Johnson working for you. And he's fun to talk to, as you can see on this podcast. And we could also do this again another time too.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Sean. Great to see you today. Thanks for having me on and wish you luck with everything. Hope to see you around soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Christopher Johnson. And thanks for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. To find out more about solar classes like my heat spring classes, which I did notice that Christopher Johnson has heat spring on his LinkedIn profile. He's a heat spring graduate. So he's extra super smart. Even though he has one of those fancy physics degrees, it's the heat spring. That's what gets you there. So check it all out. I've got lots of links. Go to solarsean.com. Over and out. Thanks, Christopher.
All right. Take care.
All right. See ya.